Thank you, Adam. I appreciate that introduction. So, I have to make sure that as I stand and I talk, I have to stand in a certain area or frame so that folks online can see me. I am a walker. I am also a talker. Okay, so let me warn you. So in the NFL and in the NBA, they have what they call a get back coach. It's a person that, when things kind of get out of line, somebody scores, and all of the players want to run onto the field, there's a coach saying, get back, right? So they don't get a penalty for going onto the field. I'm going to ask that you be my get back coach. Okay? Thank you. I appreciate that. So going beyond good intentions with DEI, there are a lot of things that I'm going to say. And for those things that I say, I have to get them right in order for them to resonate with you and in order for me to connect the dots to you. So I am going to look down at my notes occasionally, because when I say certain things, I have to say them a certain way so that you understand the context from which I'm talking about the issue or the frame. It is great to be here. And I also want to thank all of you for the work that you do in working with families and individuals with developmental disabilities. I also want to thank the Ohio Association of County Boards. Thank you, Adam, for having me. United Way's work is very similar to yours. A lot of the work support that we provide goes to families and to children that are marginalized. So, we are in some of the same spaces that you are in. And so I want to start out by talking just a little bit about how much we've grown. The 2020 census shows that Ohio's population is now at 11.8 million people. That's about a 2.3% increase from the 2010 census, or roughly about 270,000 people. It also shows that we now have people with disabilities in all 88 of Ohio's counties. And a significant portion of families, and the census shows this, a significant portion of families in our state live in poverty. What the research and what the data says and shows is that children of families living in poverty are more likely to have a disability, and their families are less likely to have the resources necessary to provide adequate care. So what you do, again, I want to emphasize it, is so very important. And for the last 2 years, I do want to recognize what we all have gone through. Pandemic, social justice issues, protests, again, all under the frame of the fact that we are changing rapidly. And in a time of rapid change, how you plan becomes even more important. We know right now that status quo is not an option, right? DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is an area where effective planning will allow you to operate and function from a proactive place rather than a reactive place. And as we sort of position ourselves to do this work, old frames of reference start to lose their relevance and their significance, meaning that new possibilities and new opportunities come your way if you are innovative. Being the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer from the position where I sit, innovation will allow you to go beyond good intentions. It will allow you to take risks. And I will say this, that doing this work may not be as hard as you think. What you're going to find out about me as I go through this presentation is I try to talk about and show people practical approaches. What I'm not going to do is share with you a lot of academic, high-level, strategic information and then say, go do that. That's not going to do you any good. I'm going to give you examples. And for some of this information, we're going to get into the tactics of it, right? How you build it. So I'm going to use our time together wisely and show you how to strengthen DEI. Some of what I talk about will definitely be rooted in research. And some of it, like I said, will be rooted in lessons learned, practical approaches. And then I'm also going to talk about barriers to effective DEI strategy. Sorry. Good. He's got it. All right. So building an organization that is more focused on DEI really starts at the top. And leaders need two things: commitment and intentionality, right? Commitment means making it a part of your role and your responsibilities. And intentionality means action, execution, and implementation. How many of you have strategic business plans? Seeing a few people, yeah. Use DEI to inform your plans. Don't do it the other way around. Start on the front end rather than starting on the back end. And in application, what that means is using it in your decision-making, your goal planning, your resource allocation, even using it in your partnerships and your communications. Here's an example. If the language in your plan states that you want to pursue stronger business partnerships, how about changing that language to say you want to pursue stronger and more diverse and equitable business partnerships, right? I also suggest that you make DEI or your commitment to DEI visual. So what do I mean by that? What does that look like? When you look on your websites, that's where a lot of people go to get information about you. But be careful of what they call performative approaches. You say on your website that you're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion by showing you have a statement denouncing racism and denouncing discrimination against people with developmental disabilities, right? But when I go to your website and I do a little bit of research, what I find is that your board of directors is not diverse. I also find that you don't even have parents of caregivers of people with developmental disabilities, right? That's what they call performative approaches. You say one thing, but your actions and your decisions mean the opposite. So in terms of values, a good practice for governance is values, right? Values play an important role. Diversity is a value that is foundational to governance. And when it's valued, it becomes more than just this check the box, right? It becomes a strength for your organization. Diversity and cultural differences strengthen your ability to deliver culturally competent and mission-centered services and programs. And the research, the research is extremely clear, especially in this day and age. Study after study proves the value. Korn Ferry just did a recent report where, citing across the board, they found that organizations are doing better when it comes to diversity. they have improved. They now better understand the economic, the moral, and the cultural value of diversity. And they also found that an attribute of a high-performing organization is, in fact, diversity, because people with different backgrounds and different experiences and different abilities see the same problems in different ways and will always, always, always come up with better solutions. So I'm seeing everybody shake their head. So you all must have read the same book that I read, right? Don't worry, I'm going to get into some stuff that I know you haven't read. Keep walking back and forth, sorry. So I did want to quickly acknowledge that when George Bush signed into law the ADA, it was the first time that full citizenship rights was granted to individuals with disabilities. And because of this law, you now have the task of operationalizing what was signed to make it a part of your DEI strategy. So what we're going to talk about, we'll talk about what that looks like. And I want to start with the behaviors that you can expect to come across as you begin to build your DEI infrastructure. So these are from Deloitte. These are the 6 personas of strategic change through a DEI lens. So in other words, they are the behaviors that you are going to come across as you start to build your infrastructure, as you start to put strategy in place. And it ranges from people who will actively sabotage your efforts all the way through to those who will be fully engaged and who will take responsibility and ownership in this work. So is there anyone that, especially in this group, is there anyone that might be worried about people who might be opposed to building DEI strategy? Anyone worried? Yeah, I got my hand up too. I've gone through it too, right? So let me say this about folks that are opposed. Sometimes when we do this work, we have to leave people behind. I don't know any other way to say it other than to say it that way, right? There are some people that will never, ever, ever be on board when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and especially equity, right? The opportunity, folks, is going to lie in those folks that are anxious and those folks that are unaware. That's where your opportunity is. These are the folks that are hungry for knowledge, and they will be your biggest allies because they want to understand. And for anyone like me, anyone fatigued, because I'm tired, right? I've done this work for a long time. I'm tired. So if there's anyone that's fatigued, what you have to remember is we are running a marathon, not a race, not a sprint, right? We're not always trying to solve for something when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we're always looking for answers, and that is what fatigues us. We're always trying to pull people along who are never going to come, right? So, for some of this work, there is no script. You just have to do it and learn by doing. And then for a lot of it, it's about application. What you're learning is most important, but application and how you apply what you're learning is what's most important, and it's the hardest piece. So, some of your efforts to move people from a place of pessimism to optimism to becoming more fully engaged, that will be where you will have to put the grind in and you will have to put the work in. And to accomplish that, One of the things that I have done well in the work that I do is I have tried to help people understand what it looks like if they're doing this work well. Diversity, equity, inclusion, it's hard to get your hands around, what does that look like if I'm doing it well? What does that look like if I'm not doing it well? So you're going to hear me talk a lot about, here's what it looks like. Here's an example, right? When you're doing it well. And it's what I call doing the work in application. Here's a couple of easy indicators. Indicator 1, people who commit to continuous learning and improvement in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's simple. Who's attending your trainings and who isn't, right? Who's attending your trainings, who isn't, who consistently shows up, keep an attendance sheet. The second indicator is people who demonstrate the ability to work effectively with individuals who are different than they are, right? Different in abilities, different in gender, different in sexual orientation, different in, you name it, age. And then the opposite of these two. Think about the opposite. This is what it looks like in doing the work in application, because you have to give people examples. The opposite, people who consistently fail to show up at trainings, right? You have an attendance sheet, you know who they are, right? If I'm a betting person, these are going to be the same people that will be less likely to show respect and engage with people of diverse backgrounds and viewpoints, right? Thank you. So, I mentioned behaviors and actions. And so with that as a sort of like this backdrop, the first step to building your DEI infrastructure is to have conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. How many of you have had conversations at a leadership level, at an organization-wide level? Everybody in the organization, good. This is what I call DEI conversational competence. A friend of mine told me this. When it comes to this work, you can't do well what you're not willing to talk about well, right? So here are a few questions for conversations that I think will help you and help provide clarity and foundations for building your DEI infrastructure. These are good questions. If I were you, I would write these down. They're very good questions. The first one. What is it about diversity, equity, and inclusion that causes discomfort, and why? Whenever we're going to talk about DEI, people get this feeling in their stomach. They get butterflies in their stomach, especially if we're going to talk about race, right? They get this feeling in their stomach, right? So, I encourage you to ask that question or have a conversation about that question. But here's what I will encourage you to do. Make sure you notice when you get those butterflies and think about it this way. Is it you? It may not be you. Or is it the context of the environment that you're in that causes the discomfort? Is it the culture that you're in, right? Because when it comes to DEI, some of the issues, some of the feelings of discomfort are people-led or people-driven, and some are culture-driven. Where does culture come from, folks? People in an organization, people are in an organization. Within an organization, where does culture come from? Top down. What'd you say? That's it, right? So, and I'm not trying to be a rebel rouser. These are the types of conversations that we have to have in order to move forward with this work. Here's a second question. Write this one down. And I'm curious to know if any of you have had these conversations. The third one, I know you've had it because you've already raised your hands. But the second one, what happens when we don't reflect about the land that we live in, about America? What happens when we don't reflect about the land that we live in? When we don't talk about the history of this country through a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion that includes the experiences of marginalized populations. Anybody want to kind of put two and two together and kind of suggest that we are where we are today because we haven't talked enough about America, where it's been, how we got to where we are today, right? And then the last one is simple. It's just a series of questions. Have you talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion? But here's what I want you to remember about that question, because I know you've raised your hand and said, yes, we've had those. It's hard to work on something if it's not defined. Have you defined it? Are you all looking at those three elements of your organization in a consistent way? Is everything in alignment with your mission when it comes to definitions, when it comes to understanding? So start with these conversations. Thank you. And after the conversations, you are well on your way to sort of beginning the work to put some structure in place around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is not the way to do it. So you have DEI kind of off to the side. They're not even together. You got your vision. This is sort of a siloed approach, right? It's not integrated, right? In fact, this has the potential for DEI to become an afterthought. People are going to forget it. They're going to forget it in this business strategy, in the resource allocation strategy. This is a good way to do it. This is an integrated approach, right? This tells me that DEI is embedded throughout your strategy framework. When you hear people say that they are building their DEI infrastructure, this is what it should look like. Got language on each strategy or each business unit or each department, right? And DEI is embedded throughout. So I always tell people, when you build your infrastructure, start somewhere. You can even start with diverse, equitable business partnerships. Don't start with all three of these, especially if you're new at it. Start with one, learn, and move to the next. It's what I call a slow and grow approach with DEI, especially if you have people in your organization that are working to sabotage your efforts, right? If you start with all of these, you're going to blow a fuse. You will make mistakes. Right? And I also don't want to miss the fact and say that when you do DEI work, it has to be internal. I know you know that, but it also has to be externally facing, right? And then when you put it together, be mindful of the teams that are in place that are helping you work on it. Are they diverse, right? Who's not represented? How do you get that perspective? If you build your strategy without diverse representation, things are going to be missed. Yes, you have to get outside perspective. And yes, I know some of you are thinking, but yes, I already agree with you, right? Adding diverse perspective will take longer. The research says that. Some of you that want to go fast in this work, you have to slow down a little bit, right? The research says that diversity will take a longer trial and error period, but you are more likely to avoid controversy and avoid mistakes in the end. So it's worth it. It's worth it. This is tactical. So I wanted to give you a specific example of something that I worked on with an organization around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is it's a policy and a process example. And it's a change that can have a big impact. So a nonprofit that I've worked with, they came to me and they wanted to increase their board diversity. And we looked at their code of ethics and it described the process or the approach. So what you see on the right side was what they had in place in the beginning. What you see on the left side is the final code after our edits. And if you can see, we focused on the process, but we also changed the language in the process to make sure that the nominating and governance committee used a more inclusive and equitable approach to achieve the outcome that they wanted to get to, right? And then I do want to say something about inclusion. Talked about diversity. I want to mention inclusion. Be mindful of bringing in diverse people to a non-diverse environment. Please be mindful of that, folks. And the reason I say that is because you could be adding folks to an intolerant culture. A culture that's not willing and not ready to accept everything that they have to offer, everything that they are bringing to the table. And let me share this with you. If I come in to your board of directors, if you invite me onto your board, or I come into your staff, and you do all this work to bring me in, okay, I'm coming on staff, I'm here. If I have a bad experience, guess who I'm going to tell? Oh, well, remember, you're trying to recruit diverse people. There's a lot of research out there that says, and you'll hear me talk about this here in a second, there's a lot of research that says we hang around people that we look like. There's nothing wrong with that, right? And I really believe there's nothing wrong with that. There's something wrong with people not something wrong with people. What people have to do is make sure they go outside of their comfort zone and hang out with people who always don't look like them, right? But the natural inclination is for us to hang around people we look like, right? So if I have a bad experience, guess who I'm going to tell? So when you try to recruit more of Shayne's, the word's already out. Shayne's already let the cat out of the bag, right? So I wanted to mention that. And then I also want to mention, and I want to make sure that we don't misinterpret inclusion by thinking that you have to have 100% involvement. That's not what inclusion is. It's not. You don't have to involve everyone in everything, right? But here's the problem. Sometimes what people do is they use the fact that they can't include a lot of people as justification to keep inviting the same people and to continue to make the same decisions, which in fact exacerbate feelings of exclusion and tokenism, right? So what will it take to succeed as you build your DEI infrastructure? So first and foremost, you need board level champions and staff level champions. I call these folks instigators for change. And literally in our organization and in many other organizations that I have worked with, we have handpicked people. You're an instigator for change. You're an instigator for change. We have done that, right? Who's at your staff tables? Who's at your leadership tables, your board tables? Who's asking questions about DEI? You have to have those people there, right? You also need a culture shift. I gave you the example earlier of me coming into your staff, me coming into your board of directors. Please be mindful of quotas and numbers. That's not what your DEI work is about. Your DEI work is about culture change. You're trying to change a culture that lacks attention, right, to DEI. And you're not forcing people to have uncomfortable conversations. That's not what this is about. Your intent really is to kind of scale up your commitment and intentionality for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and more closely align it to the values of your organization and your mission. And then finally, accountability. How many of you are leaders of your organization in here? Anyone? Okay. You might want to plug your ears when I talk about this. Okay, so anytime someone is achieving the results expected, there's a high likelihood that they're being held accountable. Very high likelihood, right? So, your efforts to build your DEI strategy, if there's no accountability, they will be an afterthought. You won't get the results, right? So, it's not your effort that's going to be questioned. No one is going to care that you tried. People are going to be looking at that bottom line number, the result. And if you don't hit the mark, that's what they're going to be asking questions about. So what it really means is holding people who govern or oversee organizations more accountable when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what are some of the barriers? First and foremost, a lack of consistent support, right? There is a growing body of research that suggests most DEI efforts fail because organizations are taking a one and done approach, right? Does anyone in this room think that providing law enforcement officers, hot button topic. Anyone think that providing law enforcement officers with IS training once every 2 to 3 to 4 years is going to change behavior? It's not going to change behavior. By the way, my wife's sister, brother, 2 brothers are in law enforcement. So I'm not knocking law enforcement, So we need a consistent learning and relearning approach to DEI. Our vice president of HR, she always says that when it comes to training, you have to be consistent, and it's okay to say and do things 7 times, 7 different ways, right? Which really reinforces the importance of repeatable processes, right? The second barrier is incivility, and you all know what incivility is. And so, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. What I do want you to know is what you see happening in our country is playing out sometimes in our workplaces. People have, somewhere along the way, they have lost respect for their colleagues, right? And according to Celeste Headley, we don't know each other anymore. 75% of white America have no non-white friends. 65% of Black America have an all-Black social network. And half of us, she says, half of us say that our friends share our political views. There was also a recent Pew Research Institute poll where they polled 10,000 Americans and found that we are more polarized now than we ever have been in our country's history, which really means we're less likely to compromise. We make decisions about where to live, who to marry, and who our friends are going to be based on what we already believe to be true, even though we haven't validated those truths. So here's my point. Within civility, we have to reset the standard in our organizations. I think that organizations have to be clear about the expected behaviors that they want to see from their associates or their employees that align with their values, and then go one step beyond. The step beyond is we have to outline the behaviors that run contrary to what our values are. We have to show people what we mean. Here's what it means to be respectful. Here's what it means to be disrespectful. Because for whatever reason, some people have a hard time figuring out what that picture looks like, right? And then finally, unconscious bias. How many of you have had unconscious bias, implicit bias training? Anybody has not had it? No? Okay, so I'm not going to go over this part then. All right. Here's what I do want you to know though. Always keep in mind when it comes to unconscious bias, please keep in mind that it is always about who a person is. It's never about what group they belong to, right? So just keep that in mind. And we also, when it comes to cultural difference, we cannot measure cultural difference based on our own cultural standard. We can't do it. I can't judge people based on my experiences, based on my family's history, my grandparents' history, right? So building DEI infrastructure. This is the roadmap right here. Conversations, right? We talked about conversations. In terms of training, here's what I always say. I mentioned earlier to take a slow and grow approach. I also mentioned the fact that everyone should have consistent training opportunities. Start with diversity. Don't start with equity. Of the three, it is the hardest piece. It is the piece that some people will naturally reject. Because for whatever reason, sometimes people think that if you want to do equity work, they've got to give something up. That's not what equity is about, right? So start with diversity, then move to inclusion, which is a little harder than equity. You can also use the intercultural development continuum. It's called the IDC, and you can look it up. It's an assessment, but it's basically a continuum of sort of like it goes beyond behaviors, but it's an assessment where you can do the assessment, and then it will tell you based on your responses where you fit, whether or not you are culturally incompetent, all the way up the continuum to where you are culturally appropriate, you are culturally more aware, and obviously based on the culture that you're talking about, it's a sliding scale, and you're going to score differently based on which group you're answering questions about. You need a board level diversity, equity, and inclusion committee chaired by a board member. How many of you have this? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to say that again. 4 people. You need a board level diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. This committee really and truly is your roadmap to stronger governance, stronger accountability, and stronger commitment when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI agenda topic every meeting. We do this at Way. We have a policy now. For any organization that we fund, you must have a diverse board. We will not fund you if you don't. Now, I'm working with many of our funded partners to get them to where they need to be, not where we want them to be, right? And, one of the things that I am encouraging them to do is place DEI on every single agenda item so that you get comfortable and you get used to having the conversations. And when it comes to the board meetings, the same thing applies. When it comes to your board level DEI committee, the same thing applies. So these two bullet points go hand in hand. I also suggest that you have an internal DEI committee. How many of you have that? And many of what I'm talking about now is best practice. And it's also easy to do. Because what happens is when you start to put these things in place, when a leader or a staff person raises their hand to say, hey, here's some committees that we need to have, what happens is people start taking more ownership of the work. And I, as a leader, this gentleman as a leader, some of you out there as leaders, you say, go do that, but just keep me updated. And some of you may want to be active. Our CEO is on our board level DEI committee. It means that much to her, right? And then, so disaggregate your data. How many of you disaggregate data? Anyone? Disaggregating data. How many of you disaggregate your outcomes data? So let me say a little bit about this. So if you want to do real or true equity work, you have to disaggregate your data, right? Showing information, showing your outcomes level data at an aggregate level is okay, but it's not telling you the true story and it's not giving you an accurate picture, right? For your 2021 outcomes, and I know it's 2021, so you may have 2021 outcomes level data come 2022, right? When you get data about people served, who are you serving? By race, by ethnicity, by gender, by sexual orientation, by ability, right? By age. That is disaggregating data. That will tell you where your gaps are when it comes to disparities. Because the real question that the disaggregated data will tell you or answer for you is who's burdened and who's benefiting from your services. Are you maintaining disparity for certain groups? Your data is going to tell you that if you disaggregate it. You know, based on current research, there's a high likelihood that I can tell you what your data is going to reveal, right? Current social indicator data says, and this is what the data says, this isn't Shayne saying this, Black and brown people are on the bottom when it comes to socioeconomic data, education data, and when you intersect race and disability, those disparities become even more profound, right? So a lot of people are shaking their head. You already know this, right? So the real question is this: are we maintaining status quo by not looking at lower level or disaggregated data, right? And then finally, I'll say create a DEI dashboard. If you create a dashboard, don't do what we did. So we have a dashboard. Our board looks at it every quarter. And we have 29 metrics, way too many metrics. I don't know why I did that, but way too many metrics. Create a dashboard, start with 2 or 3 or 4 metrics, right? That might be, an example of a metric might be staff diversity. It could be board diversity in comparison to your county demographics. And some of you may come from counties where there's not as much racial or ethnic diversity as there are in others. Just remember, you can always look at gender. You can always look at age. You can look at other indicators on your dashboard to see how you compare, right? So this dashboard, what it's going to do for you is it's really going to provide an objective and transparent way or approach for you to have conversations. Because Shayne's not saying, hey, we got issues, but I don't have any validation for it. The data is going to show the validation, right? So it's going to be a great resource for you to plan your future steps and make decisions about where you go next when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Here's some resources that I wanted to make sure that you all had, and they are links. They are in the PowerPoint. Sorry. This is a great book. For anyone that is not far along in your DEI journey, Marlon Moore was the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Huntington Bank. He's on our DEI committee. He's on many other committees as well. But diversity starts with you. This book has a lot of practical approaches and strategies that any organization can apply. And they're not academic. They're not things that you read and really have to figure out how to kind of build the approach or build the strategy. He tells you exactly how to do it. He tells you what you need in place to start. And for people that may be a little bit further ahead, there's also some additional practical approaches in there. That's all I got, folks. Questions? She's bringing the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Downton. I just wanted to thank you so much for an excellent presentation. A few things that you said really resonated with me. I'm on the Ohio Advocacy Task Force, and I'm really trying to find ways within the system to get more people with developmental disabilities on the county boards, because there are only 12 of us out of about 600 plus seats, and that's just a massive disparity. So the question I have to you is, how do we integrate disability in the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation? Because I feel like it's dominated by race and gender. So I wondered if you had any suggestions on that.
Yeah, great question. Great question. You know, the way that I would answer that question is sometimes when you want to accomplish a goal, you have to be more vocal if you don't see the results that you're getting. Now, folks, this is my approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll say it once, I'll say it twice. If I have to say it a third time, I'm going to get some other people behind me that are saying the same thing, and we're going to knock on the door and we're going to say, hey, you're not listening. So guess what? We're going to be stronger. We're going to be louder, right? The civil rights, disability rights, the reason why we are where we are today, or we've made progress, is because people didn't sit back on their morals. When people didn't listen, sometimes they knocked down the door. We are in a time of advocacy. We are in a time of protest, social protest. And I would say use all of those tools at your advantage. And I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but here's what I can tell you. How many of you have seen recently and read articles in the newspaper about organizations where discrimination suits have been filed against them? In every single one of the more recent filings, there was one thing in common. Staff said we had been saying this 2 years ago. We were saying it 6 months ago. We were saying it, and they didn't listen. So now guess what? Whoop, there it is, front page, right? So my point is this. I understand what you're saying. If there's only 12 or 13 of you serving on boards, I would say start talking to leadership and ask why, and ask how you can work with them to make sure that more voices are at the table that represent the developmental disability or disability community. Next question. I want to answer every question like that. You don't have to be afraid to ask a question.
You stated at the beginning of your presentation, you can't do well what you're not willing to talk about well. Do you believe that that probably is a central or core issue with the ability to move in such a more forward or more aggressive way with just diversity, equity, and inclusion, the language barrier that there seems to be at times?
It could be. It could be. There are a lot of variables at play. Some people want to move fast. Some people want to move slow based on the issue that they're advocating for. I think the answer lies in leadership. Again, I'm always going to go back to leadership because I've seen changes in leadership where maybe there wasn't as strong of a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? But a new leader comes in and now we are off and running, right? And I've seen the opposite of that, right? And so, there are a lot of different variables at play. And sometimes it's not the leader at the top of an organization. Sometimes it's a department head. Sometimes it's a colleague that has a better relationship with your boss. And that might be blocking, or that might be more of an advocate than you. And so, the reason why I said you can't do well what you're not willing to talk about well is because I think that approach gives you, we all need a paycheck. I need a paycheck, right? At this point in my career and in my life, I need a paycheck, right? Having conversations gives you an approach where everybody can participate, and it gives you the opportunity to see who's on board and who's not. So you'll know which leaders are on board and which leaders are not. You'll know whether your boss is on board, whether your boss is not. And so I promised you all practical approaches. I promised you all transparency. I'm not going to come in and say, here's what the research says about the question that you asked, right? There are common sense approaches to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And based on your culture, some things work and some things don't. Having conversations is one of the easiest and most foundational ways to begin to bridge gaps and kind of identify where organizations are and where leaders are when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's why I say.
Shayne, we actually have somebody online who's had a comment very similar to what you just said. They said that they actually had, they're calling it a prior regime with a non-DEI culture mentality, and that they had a lot of new hires during COVID, and the new hires left within 6 months as a result of encountering that culture. But the same person also asked a question, so there is hope with this regime. They just got started with their DEI committee, and they've had a great compilation of unique staff join that effort. Do you suggest that they utilize any particular proven template or anything that is shown to be successful in getting DEI changes launched from the beginning?
Yeah. The template or the first order of business that I would put in place is some type of way to measure what they're doing so that they can monitor and track success. Oftentimes what happens is when we do certain aspects of work, and it's not always DEI, leaders want to hold people accountable, right? And they want to know whether or not what you're doing is working. The easiest way to chart success and track success and take to leaders to show results is to create some kind of dashboard with indicators on it to say, here's the work that we have been doing, right? And here are the results that we've gotten. So that's how I would answer that question. That's sort of one approach or strategy that I would use. Just make sure that you're measuring and monitoring your success along the way in any of the strategies or efforts that they start. Over here.
First of all, thank you for all the information that you presented in your presentation. Being a person of color, it's not new to me. I've had many experiences with it. One thing that, and this is more of a comment than a question, as we talked about leadership, you know, there's a difference between leadership in a nonprofit and leadership in government. So that which a lot of us see as leadership at our organizations, there is another level of leadership, which I think speaks to one of the points you made in regards to looking at how America is run. And I'm not sure if you want to make a comment about that, but even doing all of these things, there's many layers of leadership is my point. And so that political aspect colors, controls, guides that which trickles down. And so I just wanted to put that out there, not take anything away from what you said, but it is definitely different in a nonprofit versus government with that political piece to it.
Yeah, just one comment to what you said. I hear you. I agree with you. I understand exactly what you're saying. Whether we like it or not, America is changing. The census proves that. There was an article 10 years ago called The Browning of America. We are changing. I won't see it. It will probably be on the tail end of my kids' lives, but at some point, what you referenced in terms of politics, in terms of the divide, the great divide, is going to change. There will be a flip because so let me just say that. Next question. Next question.
Well, we are actually at the end of our time conveniently, where we are not going to have to answer that question or move on any further. But please help me give Shayne a round of applause for an excellent presentation.